He woke up in the dark, and the dark was not the kind that fades when your eyes adjust. It was the dark of sealed stone, of places that had not known air for a very long time.
Chong Wu lay still on a floor that should have been cold and wasn't.
The warmth radiating from the limestone beneath him was the warmth of a building that had been standing under a desert sun for decades.
He sat up and immediately struck his head on a low arch above him.
The pain was real, which meant the darkness was real, which meant none of this was a dream.
He pressed his palm flat against the ceiling and felt the marks of individual chisel strokes in the stone.
Hand cut, not machine cut, the distinctive texture of ancient craftsmanship.
His pulse jumped because he knew those marks.
He had run his fingers over surfaces like this hundreds of times in 8 years of illegal excavations.
He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and the cracked screen flickered to life.
11% battery and one flashlight that might just save his life.
He swept the beam forward and froze.
The walls were covered in murals, and the colors were not faded.
Blue lotus on yellow ground, red solar discs, black figures outlined in gold, every pigment vivid and saturated.
He walked slowly, letting his fingers trail along the surface, and then pulled his hand back sharply.
The paint was wet.
He stared at the blue pigment on his fingertips, and his mind did the chemistry automatically.
Calcium copper silicate, fired at around 900 degrees, a recipe that had been lost to history.
Egyptian blue, and it had been applied recently, perhaps that very day.
Chong Wu pressed his back against the wall and forced himself to breathe. He was an archaeologist who specialized in places that no longer existed.
But this place existed, loudly and completely, around him right now.
He turned the light on the first cartouche carved into the wall and read the throne name of Ramesses II. Below it, a second name, Bakanhansu, High Priest of Amun, a man who held office between the 25th and 60th year of that reign. Both names together in the same corridor meant one thing. The 13th century before the Common Era.
3,320 years before the morning he had walked into a tomb with a lantern and a crowbar.
He sat down on the floor, turned off the flashlight, and let the darkness swallow him again.
9% battery, and not a single cell tower within a 3,000-year radius. Panic kills faster than any trap, he reminded himself, a rule he had learned in his first year of digging in places he was not supposed to be.
He stood up and followed the direction of the air, the way every experienced excavator learned to navigate underground.
50 steps, then a turn to the right, then 30 more, and then light.
Dim, orange, the specific flicker of an oil lamp.
He put the phone away and moved toward it.
The corridor widened into a small chamber, and a woman stood in the center of it, watching him.
She was young, robed in white linen with a wide red belt, her neck heavy with turquoise and carnelian, her head shaved completely bare.
She held a curved bronze knife in her hand, not a ritual one, a combat blade, sharpened on both sides. And she was not surprised to see him.
Behind her, 2 more women waited, one holding rope, the other cradling a narrow-necked clay vessel of the type used to store poisons. Priestesses of SEKHMET, the lion-headed goddess of war and plague, the cult that every serious Egyptologist suspected of running the ancient world's most effective intelligence network.
Chong Wu raised his hands, palms forward, a gesture so universal it predated every language ever spoken.
He didn't know if it would work, but he had nothing else.
The woman with the knife spoke 3 sharp words, and he caught one of them.
Stop.
He stopped.
She stepped closer and examined him from head to sandal, or rather from head to sneaker, her eyes moving over his jeans, his t-shirt bearing the Seoul National University logo, his rubber soles.
She reached out and rubbed the fabric of his shirt between her fingers.
Her face gave nothing away. She gave a short order, and the woman with rope moved behind him.
The knot she tied was professional,
tight, palm fiber cutting into his wrists with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before.
The lead priestess spoke a longer sentence, and Chong Wu strained to catch the shape of it. His Middle Egyptian was purely academic, built from textbooks and tomb inscriptions, not living speech. But he caught enough to understand she was asking who he was and how he had ended up in a sealed corridor. He opened his mouth and answered in the worst Egyptian ever spoken in the 13th century before the Common Era.
He said he was lost, that he didn't know how he had arrived here.
She smirked with one corner of her mouth and told her companion something that translated roughly as, "The stranger speaks the language of dead wall carvings."
An insult, but also completely accurate.
They led him up through the temple, and Chong Wu counted every turn, every staircase, every change in floor texture, the way he had always mapped underground spaces when there were no signs, only memory. Right, left, left again, a staircase of 12 steps, one more turn, and then sunlight.
The white desert sun hit him like a fist, and he stood blind for several seconds.
When he could open his eyes, he saw a courtyard of vast limestone slabs, lotus-capped columns reaching upward, incense smoke pouring from every doorway.
He recognized it, not because he had been here before, but because he had studied its plans in dozens of academic papers.
The Temple of Mut at Karnak, southern precinct of the Amun complex, but not the ruined fragment that existed in photographs of 20th century excavations. Whole, alive, flags snapping on tall masts, priests moving through it like it was simply Tuesday.
They led him across the courtyard toward the small temple of SEKHMET, a building he knew only as a foundation and 3 broken column stubs. Here it stood in full. Inside the dark hall, between columns lined with oil lamps, a granite statue of the lion-headed goddess loomed twice the height of a man. They sat him on the floor in front of the altar, tied hands aching behind him, and left 2 guards watching him without blinking.
Chong Wu waited.
The city of Karnak hummed around the temple walls, carts creaking, voices rising and falling, 10,000 people going about the business of a civilization that would not fall for another 1,200 years. He sat on the floor in the temple of the plague goddess, with a phone showing 9% battery, and nowhere to be for the next 3 millennia. But there were photos on that phone, hundreds of them, plans and maps and translations he had downloaded before his trip, including one photograph that could either save his life or end it. A ground-penetrating radar map of the underground levels of the Temple of Mut, every sealed corridor, every hidden chamber, every trap. A map known only to the builders who had walled it shut 3,000 years ago. And now to him. The door swung open about 2 hours later. The woman who entered was older, lean, with the economy of movement that belongs to people who have stopped wasting energy on anything unnecessary.
Her necklace was heavier than the younger priestesses, gold and lapis lazuli, the mark of rank.
The young woman with the knife followed her in and stood 1 step behind and to the right, a bodyguard's position. The senior priestess crouched in front of Chong Wu, slowly, smoothly, like a cat deciding whether a mouse is worth the effort. Then she spoke, and the difference was immediate. Slower, cleaner. Each syllable placed with deliberate care, so that even his broken academic Egyptian could follow. She asked where he had come from. He answered that he had come from the east. True enough, in a sense that spanned 3,000 years. She asked how he had ended up in the lower corridor. He answered that he didn't know, that he had lost consciousness and woken there.
She nodded and moved on.
Then she reached out and lifted the hem of his shirt, not to humiliate, to examine. She pulled the fabric into the lamplight, ran one finger along the seam, traced the synthetic threads, traced the logo, and for a fraction of a second, her pupils widened. She had never seen weave like this, because weave like this did not exist in the 13th century before the Common Era. She looked him in the eyes, and and said a single sentence. He translated it for himself roughly as,
"You are not from any land I know."
He said nothing.
Silence was safer than any answer.
She stood, gave a short order, and the young priestess pulled Chong Wu to his feet. They led him deeper, not upward this time, downward.
Another staircase, narrower, its steps worn smooth by thousands of feet across hundreds of years.
16 steps, a turn, 20 more, a landing, another 12 down.
Behind one door they passed, he heard muffled sounds he chose not to think about too carefully.
They put him in a stone cell with a bench, a clay jug of water, and an oil lamp in a niche.
The boat closed, and Chong Wu sat down to figure out how not to die. 8% battery.
He turned off the screen and closed his eyes, and began reconstructing from memory what he knew about this place. 3 underground levels, documented by a French expedition in the 1890s, and mapped by a British-Egyptian team using ground-penetrating radar in 2003.
He had photographed that radar map before his trip.
The lower level, never opened, showed a labyrinth of corridors surrounding one large central hall, roughly 20 by 30 meters.
He was on the middle level now, certain of it from the step count and the direction of descent.
And he knew, with the precision of someone who had read 17 scholarly articles about this site, that 6 meters east of where he was sitting, behind a stone wall, lay a sealed corridor leading down to that unknown lower level. He knew the weight of the plug blocking it, roughly 300 kilograms. He knew the dimensions of the ventilation bypass the builders had left beside it, 1 cubit wide. He knew all of this, and he could use none of it, because he could not run.
All of Karnak was a maze of tens of thousands of priests and servants and soldiers.
A man with East Asian features would not make it 100 meters before someone noticed.
So he had one option left, and it was not escape.
It was commerce.
Chong Wu opened his eyes in the dark.
In this world, at this moment in history, he possessed exactly one tradable commodity.
Information. He knew this temple better than the people who served in it every day. He knew its past, its present, and 3,000 years of its future. Wars, famines, betrayals, collapses, the names of every pharaoh who would ever modify these walls, the date the last stone would crumble to dust.
The question was how to sell that knowledge without revealing where it came from. Because the truth would not inspire curiosity.
It would inspire a bronze knife to the throat. The senior priestess returned 2 hours later, and this time she came alone, carrying a clay bowl of lentil soup and coarse barley bread.
She sat down on the floor across from him, cross-legged, as if meeting an equal, and watched him eat. When the bowl was empty, she introduced herself.
Her name was Herin, and she ran the lower sanctuary of the Temple of Mut.
The young priestess who had found him was her apprentice, Nefaru.
Then she listed what she already knew, the way an investigator lists evidence before asking for a confession.
She said his clothes were made of material that did not exist on Earth. She said his language sounded like no country she knew.
She said he had appeared in a corridor sealed shut 50 years ago from the inside.
She wasn't asking.
She was telling him that she knew and that she was already calculating what to do about it. Chong Wu made the decision that would either save his life or end it before the night was out.
He reached slowly into his pocket and took out the phone.
Herin did not flinch, did not pull back, did not scream.
She leaned forward and studied the glowing rectangle. He scrolled to the photograph he needed, the radar map of the underground levels, white lines on black ground, corridors and chambers rendered as a view from above. He turned the screen toward her.
He watched her knuckles go white where she gripped her own knees.
She recognized the map. She recognized her temple.
She understood that the man sitting in front of her knew the location of corridors that had been walled shut for decades, chambers that existed only in the knowledge of the highest priesthood.
The hall deep in the lower level that was never spoken of aloud.
She looked up from the screen and asked 2 words.
Who are you?
Not a question.
A verdict waiting for its deciding factor.
Chong Wu turned off the phone, 6%,
and told her the closest version of the truth he dared to speak.
He said he had come from a place where this temple no longer stood, where only the foundation and 3 broken column fragments remained.
He said he knew everything that would happen to this place, from today until the moment the last stone crumbled to nothing.
Herin was silent for 30 seconds.
He counted them. Then she stood, brushed off her dress, and delivered the sentence he would remember for the rest of his life.
She said he now belonged to the temple, that his knowledge belonged to her, that he would live exactly as long as he was useful, and that he had better make useful last a very long time.
She left. The boat closed. Chong Wu lay back on the stone bench and stared at the ceiling. He had just sold himself into slavery, voluntarily, for a bowl of lentil soup and 1 more day of not being dead. The next morning, Nefaru brought him a coarse linen shanty, palm sandals, and a look of professional appraisal she made no effort to soften. She assessed his height, his build, the kind of lean muscle that 8 years of climbing through tombs and hauling stones builds without meaning to. She said one word that meant something close to foreigner, a term applied to everyone who was not Egyptian, and led him upstairs. The service courtyard blinked in the early morning light, already full of servants carrying jugs and sacks, sweeping stones, scraping debris.
No one looked at him with particular interest.
One more stranger. One more pair of hands. Nefaru led him to a low workshop at the wall of the courtyard. Stone shelves lined with clay pigment vessels, reed brushes, papyrus scrolls, wax tablets for notes. Herin was seated at the far end, and a large blank papyrus had been spread on the floor. She told him that photographs on a glowing stone could be tricks, that a charlatan could have faked what he showed her. She wanted proof. She placed a brush and a bowl of ink made from soot in front of him and told him to draw the lower level. Not the middle level where he was being held. The one below, the one she considered the greatest secret of the temple.
Chong Wu picked up the brush.
His hand was steady, which surprised even him. 8 years of field work had taught him to draw plans fast and accurate, without laser rangefinders or GPS, just memory and paper. He worked for 10 minutes while Herin did not move. Main descent, 24 steps, corridor right, first fork, left passage to storage, right passage to the row of cells. His memory for architectural plans was photographic, of professional deformation, the kind that develops when you navigate places where getting lost means getting buried. He turned the papyrus toward her when he finished. He watched her compare his drawing to whatever she kept in her own memory, and he saw the exact moment she found the first match. Then the second. Then the third.
And then she found the thing that made her go very still.
In the eastern section of the lower level, he had marked a dotted line, a sealed corridor connecting the lower sanctuary to an unknown chamber beneath the outer wall.
Archaeologists in his time had theorized it was a secret evacuation route. Herin pointed at the dotted line and asked what it was.
He replied that it was a passage sealed with stone, probably during construction. She shook her head slowly. She said only 3 people had ever known about that passage. The high priestess of the temple, the builder who bricked it up, and now him. The builder had died 40 years ago. The high priestess 5 years ago. Herin herself had become the 4th when she took office, and Chong Wu had just become the 5th. She rolled up the papyrus and placed it in a leather case. Then she told him what his position in her world would be. He would work for her, and only for her. No one in the temple would learn what he knew. To everyone else, he was a foreign servant, a sweeper, a porter, a nobody. If he tried to tell anyone what he knew, she said, they would kill him before he could finish his first sentence. Not her personally. Those above her in the hierarchy, those who would not tolerate a leak, those who had been running this secret architecture for generations. Chong Wu listened and understood precisely what he was. Herin was not the top of this structure. She was a middle manager, high enough to make decisions about prisoners,
not high enough to protect him from anyone above her.
His knowledge was her trump card in the temple hierarchy, and he was the expendable material the card was made from.
When she played it, she would discard it.
He told her he understood the turns.
She gave him the same smirk he had already seen on Nefaru, the mentor having taught the student well. And then she gave him his first task.
The northeast corner of the small SEKHMET temple was sinking. A crack in the wall was widening.
The pharaoh's engineers had recommended shoring, but shoring would damage the temple's appearance, and the council of priestesses was displeased.
She wanted an alternative.
Chong Wu closed his eyes and pulled up everything he knew about that corner from excavation reports. The cause was documented. An ancient irrigation canal had been filled in during original construction and was compacting unevenly beneath the foundation, creating a growing void.
The shoring fixed the symptom from above.
The problem lived below.
He opened his eyes and told her the shoring would fail within 5 years.
The only real fix was to fill the void. Crushed stone and a lime sand mixture, poured through pits dug from outside at the base of the wall.
She asked how he knew about the canal beneath the foundation.
He said he had seen traces on the surface, a slight depression in the soil along the old channel, a different color of earth.
A lie, but one that could be verified, because the traces were real if you knew where to look, which he did.
Herin left without a word.
Nefaru told him to wait.
2 hours later, workers were digging a test pit at the northeast corner of the temple.
When the shovels reached 1.5 meters deep, a worker shouted,
An old canal, exactly where Chong Wu had said.
Herin turned to look at him, and in her eyes he read the new calculation she was already running.
He had just proven his worth.
He had just bought himself more time, though he couldn't know yet if that meant a month or a year.
That evening, Nefaru led him back to his cell on the middle level, but now there was a reed mat on the bench.
A small jug of beer stood in the niche beside the lamp. Small improvements, small rewards.
The same logic that gives a workhorse an extra handful of grain after a good day.
Chong Wu lay down on the mat and took out his phone.
5%. He scrolled through hundreds of photographs, plans, maps, translations. Every file a potential extension of his life. Every image another task he might be given, another proof of usefulness.
He turned the screen off and placed the phone under the mat.
In the dark of the cell, he listened to the temple breathing around him.
Footsteps, voices, the distant rattle of a sistrum, the ritual percussion instrument of SEKHMET's priestesses.
Thousands of people living a life he had only ever studied in articles. And somewhere at the bottom of that world, lying on a reed mat, was one illegal archaeologist from the 21st century with a dying phone and a head full of knowledge that was simultaneously the only thing keeping him alive and the most dangerous thing about him.
The first 3 weeks passed in the rhythm of ordinary labor. By day, Chong Wu carried water from the sacred lake, swept courtyards, assisted in the temple's kitchens.
Rough work that made him invisible, one more ordinary servant among dozens.
By evening, Nefaru collected him for the workshop, where Herin asked specific, practical questions.
What was the depth of groundwater beneath the main courtyard?
Where did the drainage channels run?
Why did the red paint on the western columns fade faster than on the eastern ones?
Chong Wu answered from memory, from logic, occasionally from a carefully constructed bluff built on facts he could point to afterward.
Groundwater levels from hydrological reports, drainage from excavation plans, pigment deterioration from chemical analysis of samples in his own century, the western columns receiving more direct sun, ultraviolet destroying iron-based red compounds faster than the sheltered eastern face.
Herin did not thank him. She recorded everything on wax tablets and said nothing, which in her vocabulary was acceptance.
In the 4th week, a conversation overheard while sweeping a hall floor changed everything.
2 priestesses were talking quietly nearby, and by that point, Chong Wu's brain had adapted enough that he thought in Egyptian when listening, and only translated back into Korean for the most difficult concepts. They were discussing the Grand Council of SEKHMET, scheduled in 10 days, an assembly of senior priestesses from every major temple in Egypt.
And they mentioned something else, almost in passing.
The conflict between the cult of SEKHMET and the cult of Amun.
Chong Wu stood in the hall with a rag in his hand and felt the information ignite inside him. He knew this conflict from textbooks, from deciphered papyri, from scholarly arguments spanning 3 generations of Egyptologists.
The priests of Amun held the official power, the high priest the second rank in all of Egypt after the pharaoh himself.
But the cult of SEKHMET controlled things that Amun could not: intelligence, political assassinations, the quiet elimination of inconvenient facts.
The 2 cults had maintained a delicate balance for decades, and Chong Wu knew precisely when that balance would break.
That evening in the workshop, for the first time in 3 weeks, he spoke first.
He told Herin he knew about the upcoming council meeting and that he knew how the conflict with Amun would end.
She stood up slowly and walked to the door to check the hallway before closing it.
Then she came back and sat closer than usual.
She asked, very quietly, what he knew.
He paused. He understood the gravity of the next few sentences. One wrong phrase, and he would shift from useful tool to dangerous anomaly, and the order had very particular methods for dealing with dangerous anomalies.
He began carefully.
The priests of Amun were preparing to expand their land holdings, he said.
Bakanhansu wanted control over 3 villages south of Karnak, villages currently belonging to the cult of SEKHMET.
He watched the muscles in Herin's neck tighten.
He continued, Bakanhansu would act through the pharaoh, submitting a petition during a favorable moment, after a successful sacrifice, when Ramesses was generous and not paying close attention to the details. Chong Wu knew all of this, not from prophecy, but from a papyrus found in 1927, an administrative record of land redistributions from the 28th year of Ramesses' reign. 3 villages transferred to Amun, no explanation given, just a recorded fact.
But the transfer had not happened yet. He had just turned a historical footnote into a weapon. Herin asked the question he had been waiting for.
Could it be prevented?
He answered honestly. He didn't know. His knowledge described what had happened, not what would happen if someone intervened.
Every intervention created a divergence.
She smirked with both corners of her mouth this time, almost a full smile, and said he sounded like the oracle at the temple. Many words, little certainty, but she appreciated the warning.
He took one more risk.
He told her this was only the beginning, that the conflict between SEKHMET and Amun would escalate, that within a few years the priests of Amun would accumulate enough power to threaten the pharaoh himself, and that ultimately this would fracture the new kingdom from within.
Herin stared at him for 10 seconds.
20. Then she said the sentence that told him exactly how the balance had shifted.
She said he had just become 10 times more valuable and 10 times more dangerous than he was yesterday.
She left.
He lay in the dark of his cell and understood what he had done. He had just graduated from repair consultant to political oracle. His life expectancy had increased.
His list of potential enemies had grown at the same rate.
The next morning, Nefaru took him not to the courtyard, but back to the workshop.
Herin was already there with fresh papyrus and ink.
She wanted everything he knew about the priests of Amun. Names, titles, connections, weaknesses, a chronology of their actions across the next 15 years.
Chong Wu sat down and spoke for 4 hours.
Bakanhansu, high priest, had held office since the 25th year of Ramesses' reign and would die in his position in 15 years.
His successor, Ramesses, would be more aggressive, willing to challenge the pharaoh's authority directly. Under Ramesses, the land holdings of the Temple of Amun would swell to 1/3 of all cultivated land in Egypt.
Herin's writing was getting faster.
The information was too detailed, too specific, too accurate, and her hand was trying to keep pace with the implications. When he finished, she placed the papyri in the leather case alongside his map of the underground corridors.
She told him he would no longer work in the courtyards.
From now on, he was assigned to the workshop, with a cover story for anyone who asked, a translator of Eastern documents, a rare specialist hired for a considerable sum.
From servant to specialist.
From sweeper to asset.
The cell was the same, the bolt on the door was the same, but the corridor of possibility had grown slightly longer.
3 days before the Grand Council, Herin arrived at the workshop late in the evening, alone, without Nefaru, for the first time since his arrival.
Chong Wu was sitting on the floor trying to transfer information from his phone to his memory while he still had battery to compare against.
3%.
He was photographing diagrams with his eyes, closing them and reproducing the images from memory, then reopening to check.
She sat across from him and placed a small leather pouch on the floor between them.
She untied it and emptied out 3 clay tablets, field reports from SEKHMET agents in other cities.
She read them to him herself, not expecting him to struggle through the cursive.
Amun's priests were constructing new grain storage, capacity far beyond the temple's current needs, infrastructure built in advance of resources not yet transferred.
A delegation from the Temple of Amun had arrived, bearing gifts of gold and fine linen, gifts of quality that meant one thing, not courtesy, payment.
A man named Unnefer, listed as an assistant to Bakanhansu, had met twice in the past week with the head of the city guard, both meetings at night, both in residential neighborhoods, both off the record.
Herin finished and looked at him, waiting for the analysis.
Chong Wu thought carefully. He knew the name Unnefer from an inscription in Tomb 40 in the Valley of the Nobles.
Not an assistant.
A treasure.
The man who would reform the financial architecture of the Temple of Amun and transform it into an economic superpower. He told Herin that Unnefer was far more dangerous than the intelligence suggested, that he was not an assistant but the future treasurer, that his meetings with the head of the guard meant Bakanhansu was already seeking military alignment for plans that had not yet been announced.
She asked how he knew about Unnefer's true role.
He said he had seen documents.
True, in the narrowest sense, an inscription in a tomb that had not been built yet.
She did not press him.
She had long since made her peace with the impossibility of his sources.
She asked the practical question, what should be done about Unnefer?
He chose his words with care because he knew what she was really asking, and he knew what the Order of SEKHMET was capable of.
He said that eliminating Unnefer would solve nothing. Another would take his place, perhaps a worse one.
Better to know the enemy than to create a new one from unknown material.
Herin tilted her head slightly, a gesture that looked identical to approval and to thought.
She gathered the tablets back into the pouch and stood.
At the door, she paused, turned, and said that at the Grand Council, she would face the 7 senior priestesses of SEKHMET, the most powerful women in Egypt's shadow hierarchy, for the first time, from a position of strength.
Thanks to him. She didn't thinkin'.
She stated it the way she stated everything, as a fact.
Chong Wu sat alone in the workshop after she left and absorbed the scale of what he had become part of.
7 temples, 7 cities, a network woven through every major center of power in Egypt. Intelligence, counterintelligence, poisons, political assassinations, all of it coordinated by women whose names would never appear in stone.
He was 2% battery away from becoming the intellectual engine of one of its nodes. He scrolled to the last photograph he needed memorized before the phone died.
A year-by-year chronological table of Ramesses' reign, wars, treaties, construction, deaths, appointments, 67 years compressed into a single image.
He looked at it until he could see it with his eyes closed.
Then the screen flickered.
1%.
He turned it off.
He set it on the floor next to him, a small black rectangle, the last physical artifact from his world, already becoming just glass and metal.
The Grand Council began at dawn. Chong Wu was in his cell for the duration.
The middle level had emptied out completely, every priestess upstairs for the assembly, every servant occupied with serving it.
He sat on the stone bench and listened to the silence
below the silence.
Upstairs, the 7 senior priestesses of 7 cities were deciding the political direction of Egypt's most effective shadow organization.
Downstairs, the man whose information they were building strategy around counted the seconds and thought about escaping. He pressed his palm against the east wall.
6 meters beyond it lay the sealed corridor to the lower level.
Beyond the lower level lay the secret exit beyond the temple walls, known to exactly 2 people in the world, Herin and him.
He began sketching a route in the dust on the floor with one finger, tracing the passage from his cell through 2 walls to the sealed corridor.
He got as far as calculating the limestone thickness before he wiped it clean with his palm. Too early.
The door opened when the walls had begun to cool with evening.
Nefaru stood there and said only that Herin was waiting upstairs.
He followed her through the middle level, up through the column hall, through a side passage to a small private room with low ceilings and the scent of myrrh and old sweat.
Herin was sitting in a wooden chair with armrests.
A chair with a backrest. Status communicated in furniture.
There was a small table beside her with a jug of wine and 2 cups, one for her and one for him.
She poured without ceremony and handed him his cup. He took it. Egyptian wine was thick and sweet, the grapes harvested late, and it warmed his throat on the way down.
She told him about the council.
She had presented the intelligence about Bakanhansu's plans, the granary in Memphis, the delegation to Abydos, Unnefer's nighttime meetings.
Some of it confirmed what the senior priestesses already knew.
Some of it was new.
But the reaction that mattered was when she pieced all the fragments into a single coherent picture.
The room had changed.
She had received approval, support, resources, the kind of institutional backing that usually took years of careful positioning to earn. Then, her voice changed.
Quieter.
A problem had emerged. One of the 7 senior priestesses had not left satisfied.
The eldest, from Heliopolis, 62 years old, 30 years at the head of her temple's operations.
Her name was Maripa, and she had asked one question during the session that Herin could not fully answer.
Where did this information come from? No intelligence network produces details this precise.
Herin had refused to name the source, citing security.
Maripa had not pressed a point.
She had simply listened, remembered, and said nothing more.
Chong Wu set his cup down on the floor.
His hands were steady.
Everything else was not.
Maripa of Heliopolis.
He searched his memory for that name and found nothing. Not in textbooks, not in academic articles, not in any papyrus, not anywhere. Bakanhansu he could predict years in advance because the high priest of Amun had carved his name into stone for 3,000 years.
But Maripa had left no inscriptions.
She had done her job too well.
The most dangerous kind of adversary. Invisible.
And now the invisible one was hunting for him.
He asked Herin everything she knew about Maripa.
For the first time in 2 months, he was demanding information rather than providing it.
Herin raised one eyebrow and then answered. 62 years old.
30 years run in Heliopolis. She had outlived 4 pharaohs and 3 high priestesses.
Her agent network was the oldest and most extensive in the order. She had a habit, Herin said, of eliminating problems before they became threats.
Chong Wu asked if she meant eliminating them literally. Herin looked at him for a long time. Then she said that in 30 years of Maripa's tenure, there had not been a single political scandal in Heliopolis.
Not one.
In a city of 5,000 priests and 24 temples, that was not coincidence.
It was prevention. He understood immediately.
He was a potential problem.
An anomaly in the system, a source of impossible information, a fact that did not fit the established picture.
Maripa would want to understand what he was.
And once she understood, she would want to resolve him. He told Herin they needed a cover story, a plausible explanation for his knowledge, not for SEKHMET's own people, but for Maripa.
Herin nodded.
She had already thought of this. She suggested a Canaanite merchant, a trader in information rather than goods, the kind who existed across the eastern Mediterranean.
Chong Wu shook his head.
His face was not Canaanite.
His accent was not Canaanite.
Any real merchant from that world would see the forgery in seconds.
He suggested something else, a fugitive scribe from Hattusa, the Hittite capital.
The Hittites were distant enough to be difficult to verify.
The Hittite court was full of defectors, people who fled with documents and sold them to whoever would pay.
It explained the strange accent. A man who had grown up speaking Hittite would mangle Egyptian exactly as Chong Wu was mangling it.
Herin considered this and said it was not perfect, but sufficient to buy time.
She left him an empty cup as she departed, a small, legible reminder that wine was a privilege, not a right.
He walked back to his cell alone, unescorted.
That was not a sign of trust.
He noticed two priestesses he had never seen before positioned in the corridor outside, not guarding him, watching him.
The difference was subtle and absolute.
He lay on his mat in the dark and thought about what he needed.
He needed eyes in the temple.
Allies, not masters. People with their own interests. People whose interests might occasionally align with his.
He thought about Nefaru.
23 years old, 11 years in the order. Loyal to Herin, but not with love.
Loyal the way a skilled professional is loyal to a good employer, ready to renegotiate if a better offer appeared.
That was workable. 3 days after the council, Maripa had not left Karnak.
Every other senior priestess had returned to her city.
Maripa remained. She moved through the temple like a shadow, speaking to priestesses, to cooks, to the boys who cleaned the lamps.
She wasn't searching for anything specific. She was building a complete picture, and when the picture was finished, she would find what did not fit. Chong Wu asked Herin for a meeting with Nefaru, separate, without Herin present.
His cover story? He wanted to practice the cursive script he needed for working on documents.
Herin smiled at the lie, but did not object.
She was curious where it would lead.
Nefaru came to his cell with a tablet and a stylus, and they did genuinely work on cursive.
He needed the skill, and it was real practice. But between exercises he talked with her, carefully, without pressure.
He asked about her life, how long she had been in the temple, what had drawn her to service.
She had arrived at 12 years old, given by a mother who could not feed 5 children. The temple had taken her because she was fast and quiet.
2 qualities valued in intelligence work.
She was 23 now, 11 years in the order, 4 under Herin's direct command.
He listened less to the facts than to the tone.
When Nefaru spoke of Herin, her voice became even and dry.
Respect without warmth. Loyalty without affection.
She served because Herin was the best, not because she loved her.
On their second evening session, he asked her what she knew about Maripa. Nefaru froze.
The stylus paused over the wax.
She looked at him, and something shifted in her eyes. Not suspicion, but recalibration.
She was reassessing him in real time.
Until that moment, he had been Herin's tool to her. Tools did not ask strategic questions.
She answered anyway.
Maripa moved through the temple like a shadow and talked to everyone because she was building a complete picture, and when the picture was ready, she would find the thing that did not belong.
Chong Wu asked what did not belong right now.
Nefaru answered with one word.
Him. A stranger who had appeared without origin, been moved from servant to translator without explanation, who lived underground instead of in the servants' quarters, who met only with Herin and Nefaru.
An anomaly that would be visible to someone who watched the world the way a cobra sensed movement, not with eyes alone.
He told Nefaru directly that he needed her help, not Herin's, hers, personally.
He said Maripa would reach him eventually, and when that happened, he would need to know what she knew.
He needed someone watching the hunter while the hunter watched the prey.
Nefaru looked at him for 5 full seconds.
Then she asked what she would receive in return.
He said he knew the future of the Temple of SEKHMET across the next several decades.
Herin received tactics from him, current intelligence for immediate battles.
But he could give Nefaru something Herin was not providing, a strategy for her own career, where to position herself in 5 years, which alliances to build, which people to avoid.
Nefaru was silent for a full minute.
Then she set the stylus down, stood, walked toward the door, stopped, and without turning around, told him that Maripa ate figs in the south garden every day from noon to the middle of the second hour, alone, without accompaniment.
Habits, she said, create opportunities.
Then she left.
She had not said yes.
She had not said no.
She had given him information on credit.
He had a second contact in the temple.
The next day, Chong Wu walked through the south garden at noon, under the pretext of his translator's access to the temple's upper levels.
A few palms, blooming acacias, a small sacred pool with murky green water.
An old woman sat on a stone bench beside it, eating figs.
Small, thin, dark bronze skin, crossed with deep wrinkles. Gray hair cut short rather than shaved. The privilege of age.
She broke each fig in half before eating it and examined the flesh inside.
A poisoner's habit.
Check everything, even fruit, even in your own temple.
He walked past at 10 paces, a servant on an errand, and out of the corner of his eye he saw her scan him.
1 second.
2.
A disinterested glance, or a perfect imitation of one.
With Maripa, there was no way to tell the difference.
He returned to the workshop and sat with a blank papyrus for a long time.
He could not deceive this woman. The Hittite scribe story would collapse at the first serious interrogation.
So deception was not the answer.
He didn't know yet what the answer was.
But he knew one thing. A person who runs from a cobra dies of exhaustion.
A person who stands still may live longer if the cobra decides they are not prey.
Maripa found him on the 5th day, standing in a corridor between the workshop and the supply room, positioned so naturally that for a moment he wasn't sure whether she had been waiting or whether the encounter was chance.
With Maripa, there were no coincidences.
She spoke first. Her voice was low and even, each word placed separately, like stones stacked into a wall. She said she needed a translator for an Eastern language, Hittite, and she had heard that the new translator at the Temple of Mut was fluent.
Chong Wu bowed briefly and said he was ready to help.
She took a small roll of papyrus from the folds of her dress and handed it to him.
He unrolled it and felt the floor tilt slightly under his feet.
Cuneiform. Hittite cuneiform. 8 lines.
He could read cuneiform at a basic level. Any archaeologist who had worked in the Near East had the foundations.
But Hittite cuneiform was not Akkadian cuneiform. Different characters, different grammar, different ideograms.
He could make out perhaps a third of it, half if the text was formulaic.
He looked more closely.
The opening was a standard greeting, a form he had seen in textbooks.
The third line contained a royal name, Hattusili.
Hattusili III, contemporary of Ramesses, author of the famous peace treaty between Egypt and the Hittites.
Chong Wu knew that treaty's text by heart.
He had read it in translation dozens of times.
He began to read aloud, slowly, deliberately, hesitantly.
A translator who is too fluent raises questions.
An average translator causes only mild irritation.
He rendered the first 4 lines, a greeting from the court of Hattusili to the court of Ramesses, a request for silver for the temple of the storm god, standard diplomatic correspondence.
He admitted he could not read the 5th line completely. Unfamiliar signs.
He translated the 6th and 7th roughly, something about a coastal trade route. He recognized the 8th line, the standard closing formula.
Maripa listened to all of it without moving.
When he finished, she rolled up the papyrus and placed it back in her dress. She asked where he had learned cuneiform.
He gave the prepared answer. In Hattusa, in the palace archives, as an apprentice to the chief scribe.
She asked the chief scribe's name.
He gave the name he knew from the tablets, Pia, chief of the palace scribes under Hattusili III,
a real historical figure.
Maripa gave no indication of whether she recognized the name.
She thanked him politely and left.
Chong Wu stood in the corridor and felt sweat cooling on his back.
He had just been through his first interrogation, dressed as a translation exercise.
He returned to the workshop and told Herin immediately. No omissions.
Hiding his contact with Maripa would cost more than the truth. Herin's face darkened with every sentence.
When he finished, she walked to the wall and pressed her palm against it.
She said the papyrus was a test and that Maripa would send it to an expert to compare against his translation. His 70% accuracy was a vulnerability, but it was a plausible one.
No translator reads every text perfectly. The question was whether Maripa's expert would conclude he was a mediocre translator, or whether she would conclude he was not from Hattusa at all.
Herin made her decision. They would act preemptively, a controlled disclosure, not the full truth, but half of it, the half that would satisfy Maripa's curiosity enough to make her stop digging.
She would tell Maripa that the translator was a man of unknown origin with inexplicable knowledge, that she had found him, interrogated him, and was using him, and that the results were 100% verified.
Chong Wu shook his head.
That did not solve the problem.
I created and doing. If Maripa learned he was a source of impossible knowledge, she would want him for herself, or remove him.
Herin looked at him, and for the first time, something resembling genuine respect crossed her face.
She said he was thinking correctly, but not all the way through.
Maripa was not a monemi.
Maripa was a potential partner.
If his knowledge covered all of Egypt and not only Karnak, it was valuable to all 7 temples. If Herin offered Maripa access to that knowledge in exchange for an alliance, she would gain the most powerful protector in the order.
Chong Wu understood the plan, and he went cold. She was going to sell him to 2 mistresses simultaneously. His chain was not being removed.
It was being lengthened with more hands on the other end. The meeting between Herin and Maripa took place 2 nights later in the lower sanctuary. Herin recounted it to him the next morning, dryly, facts without emotion.
Maripa had asked 3 questions.
How long had Herin been using the source?
5 weeks.
How accurate were the predictions?
100%. And she listed the verified instances: the canal under the foundation, the granary in Memphis, the Abydos delegation, Unnefer's meetings with the guard commander.
What did the source want?
He wanted to live.
Maripa had said that was a reasonable wish, and that she wanted to meet him in person.
That evening, Nefaru led him to the private meeting room, where he had drunk wine with Herin after the council.
3 chairs now, 3 cups. Herin in the center, Maripa to the right.
He entered and stopped.
Up close, Maripa looked older than she had in the garden.
Deep wrinkles, thin skin, hands with prominent veins.
But her eyes were young and black and sharp, the eyes of a hawk in the body of an old woman.
He sat down.
She spoke without greeting.
She said she knew he was not a Hittite scribe.
His translation had contained 2 characteristic errors made by someone who knew Akkadian cuneiform but not Hittite.
A scribe from Hattusa would never confuse those signs.
She said she had checked every trade caravan arriving from the east over the past 3 months.
Not one had brought a man with his features.
She had checked the river ports and the seaports. No traveler matching his description had crossed the Egyptian border.
He had appeared out of nowhere like a ghost, or like a god.
She fell silent and waited.
Chong Wu made the decision that had been forming for 5 days.
He was not going to lie.
Not entirely. He was going to tell the truth, the version that could not be verified and could not be disproved. He said he had come from a time that had not yet arrived.
He said that in his time, this temple lay in ruins, and only the foundation and 3 broken column fragments remained.
He said he was not a god, not a demon, not a messenger from anyone.
He was a man who had found himself in the wrong position in time.
The oil lamps crackled.
Shadows moved across the walls.
Maripa looked at him for 10 seconds.
20.
30.
Then she turned to Herin and asked if she believed it.
Herin said she did not, that she believed only in results, and the results were flawless.
Maripa turned back to him.
She asked whether he knew her future.
He answered honestly, he did not.
The history he knew recorded kings and temples, wars and treaties, construction and destruction.
Individual people were in the record if their names had been carved into stone.
Bakanhansu was recorded because the high priest of Amun had carved his own name everywhere.
Maripa was not recorded anywhere because people who ran secret operations for the state left no names.
Maripa smiled for the first time, a dry, compact expression, the smile of a woman who was difficult to surprise.
She said it was the best news she had heard in a long time.
The absence of her name in the stone meant she had done her job correctly. Invisibility was success, not oblivion.
She turned to Herin and accepted the offer.
Regular access to the source in exchange for her protection, her network, her resources, and her silence.
No written agreement, no witnesses, except Chong Wu himself.
At the door, she paused and asked one final question. Did he know how Ramesses' reign would end?
He told her.
Ramesses would die an old man in the 67th year of his reign, the longest in Egyptian history.
But after his death, the collapse would begin. His successor would be old and weak.
The pharaohs who followed would be weaker still.
The priests of Amun would seize real governing power.
In 200 years, the new kingdom would cease to exist.
Maripa stood motionless through all of it.
Then she nodded slowly. She said she was 62 years old and would not live to see the collapse.
But she wanted to know that what she had spent 30 years building would survive her, that the order would outlive her, that it would not disappear one generation after her death.
She left.
Herin poured wine into 2 cups and handed him one.
She said he had just acquired a second mistress.
He took the cup and replied that the number of masters did not change a slave's condition.
Herin looked at him with an expression he had come to recognize, acknowledgement of another person's pain without any desire to ease it. She said he was not a slave, that a slave does not choose whom to serve, and he had chosen twice.
He took a sip and did not argue. She was technically correct.
He had chosen between death and submission, between the knife and the chain.
A choice, formally speaking.
In practice, survival is not a choice.
Survival is a reflex.
2 days later, Maripa left Karnak, but not before leaving Herin 3 items.
A pouch of gold rings, a sealed scroll bearing the authority of her network across Egypt, and a small clay amulet in the shape of a lioness with 3 parallel scratches on the side.
Herin showed him the amulet and explained what it meant.
The highest level of access in Maripa's network. Fewer than 10 such amulets in all of Egypt, each granting the bearer immediate assistance and absolute silence from any of her agents in any city.
In 5 weeks, his knowledge had elevated Herin from the middle tier of the order to a position that ordinarily took decades of careful service to reach. He had bought her an alliance with the most powerful intelligence operator in Egypt.
But as he listened, he understood the geometry of what this meant. Every operation he helped design, every piece of intelligence that proved accurate, pushed him further from being a captive and closer to being an architect of events.
And every event he changed pulled him further from the future he knew.
The history he carried in his memory was a map, and every successful intervention made the terrain diverge from it a little more.
Herin had said once that a map which differs from the terrain is still better than no map at all. He thought about that in the dark of his cell and decided she was right, and that it frightened him anyway.
The phone died the following week.
He pressed the button in the morning, and the screen stayed dark.
0%.
He held it in his hands for a long moment, a small black rectangle, useless now, and felt the last thread connecting him to his world go slack.
He placed it at the bottom of the bag, where he kept his jeans, his t-shirt, his sneakers,
artifacts from another life he could not bring himself to discard.
He needed them there, not for practical reasons, as proof that he was real, that his world had existed, that he had not simply always been here.
Herin noticed the change in him immediately and asked what had happened.
He said the glowing stone had died.
She asked whether he had kept everything that was inside it.
He touched his temple.
"Everything here," he said. She nodded and turned to the work, and so did he, because the map was now only in his head, and the territory was still changing, and he had no choice but to keep moving through it.